From Deloitte Tax, welcome to the Tax News and Views podcast. In this series, we talk to specialists from Deloitte about the latest business issues and developments. I'm Carrie Falkenhayn, your host for Tax News and Views. And today we are revisiting the topic of the Inflation Reduction Act green energy credits. Joining me today are Jamie Park and Mike Kohler, who will be speaking about the temporary and proposed regulations related to the direct payment and transferability provisions that were part of the Act. In earlier podcasts, we discussed that these provisions allow certain organizations for certain types of credits to receive cash payments from the government, while other credits can be transferred by organizations that are generating the credits to other organizations for compensation. And while these are new and unique provisions, they had a host of unanswered questions, some of which we're going to talk about today and how the new regulations attempted to address them. So as I said, joining me today are Jamie and Mike. Jamie is part of Deloitte's Washington National Tax Group, but prior to joining us in 2022, she was with the IRS Office of Chief Counsel, and she also was an IRS fellow for the House Ways and Means Committee, where she worked on the Build Back Better Act, which laid some of the foundation for the provisions we'll be discussing today. Mike is also with Deloitte's Washington National Tax Group, where he focuses on partnership tax issues, and he's focused on the renewable energy industry for his entire career. So both excellent experts to have with us today. And let's just get started by talking about what were the three most significant choices that Treasury and the IRS made when drafting these temporary and proposed regulations. And Jamie, maybe you can get us started.
Sure, thank you. So before I answer that question, I just want to observe that at Deloitte Tax, we think these temporary and proposed regulations were very thoughtful and clear and comprehensive. And we want to congratulate and thank Treasury and the IRS for their efforts and especially for the care that they showed towards listening and responding to many of the comments that were submitted. So as to your question, so any list like this is bound to be subjective and incomplete. But if I have to pick three most important choices that were reflected in these regulations, first, I would say it's how the credit amount is affected by the use of tax-exempt income to acquire eligible property. So this question comes up often because the IRA and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which passed prior to IRA, has many tax benefits related to energy projects. And they not only involve tax benefits, but also DOE grants, EPA grants, and other federal government grants and forgivable loans. So Treasury and the IRS received many comments as to, what happens when an applicable entity purchases an investment credit property using income that's exempt from tax. So they would be receiving these DOE grants and also using that grant amount to place and service energy projects for which they're getting the tax credits. This question doesn't come up so much with taxable entities because grants and forgivable loans are generally included in gross income unless otherwise specifically excluded. And as a result, the basis of the eligible property would not decrease by this amount. So what do you do when tax-exempt entities get these grants, which are not taxable to tax-exempt entities? And the regulation says that you have to take that into account for your credit, but only under two circumstances. So one circumstance, but it's two parts to this circumstance. One is that it's only applicable if the tax-exempt amount was obtained for the specific purpose of acquiring an investment credit property. And second, if it meets the specific purpose test, the credit is reduced, but only to the extent the tax-exempt income, the tax-exempt amount, and the credit amount do not exceed the basis of the investment credit property. Say, if you made $100, if you invested $100 to an energy property, and $30 of that 100 would be the credit, and then let's say you received $100 grant amount, then now you actually have benefited by 130, which is greater than the investment credit property basis of 100. So that's the only cases where the credit would be reduced. And I think this was a really good choice that the Treasury made. The second item is the recapture rules. So section 6418 requires a transferor to notify the transferee if an investment credit property is disposed of or otherwise ceases to be investment credit property. And the transferee, so the buyer, would be subject to the recapture of the credits. The regulations confirm this requirement that's provided in the statute, but it also provides a special rule for partnerships or S corporations for certain recapture events. So it provides that if recapture results from the reduction of an S corporation shareholder's interest or a partner's interest in general profits, the recapture is imposed on that shareholder or the partner and not the transferee or the buyer. I think this was a significant choice made by Treasury in recognizing that not all recapture events should fall under the responsibility of the transferee because some of the events is not related to the operation of the energy projects. So that's my two. And my last one, before we go to Mike, is the anti-abuse rule. As the proposed regulations provide an anti-abuse rule to ensure that the transferability election is carried out as intended by Congress. And we see these anti-abuse rules in other Treasury guidance to ensure that the intent and purpose of the Internal Revenue Code provisions are carried out. And similarly, Treasury and the IRS. So in this situation, Treasury and the IRS saw the need to include anti-abuse rules to recharacterize a transaction's income tax consequences where the parties engage in transaction with the principal purpose of avoiding tax liability beyond the intent of 6418. So these are my three top choices. How about you, Mike?
Jamie, my top three list probably includes what I'd call the three most important judgment calls made by Treasury and the IRS. In other words, choices that needed to be made, but were not clearly prescribed one way or the other by the statutory language itself. These include, first one, application of the existing passive loss rules with respect to the buyers of tax credits. Treasury and the IRS faced a difficult choice. Do credits that are transferred pursuant to Section 6418 constitute passive activity credits in the hands of the buyers? Statute was basically silent on this issue, and good arguments pro and con existed. On the one hand, the buyer of a credit has no involvement whatsoever in the credit generation activities. So in a common sense way, you could say that they are passive with respect to those activities. On the other hand, the way that passive is defined for this purpose gave a reasonably strong argument that buyers are not passive. So from a technical perspective, I think the government could have gone both ways. The stakes of the decision were very significant as well. If passive activity rules did not apply to the buyer, then individuals could purchase a tax credit and thus reduce their federal income tax payments. So all else being equal, this likely would have significantly increased the supply of capital available to finance the activity subsidized in this way by Section 6418. On the other hand, expanding the range of potential buyers to individuals would almost certainly have really greatly increased the administrative challenges posed by credit transferability and potentially also increased the potential for fraud. Now, this is fraud both on the government and as well as potentially on the individuals who might have sought to purchase credits. In effect, it would have been harder to police the potential double sell of the same credit to two different individuals. Now, what did Treasury and the IRS do? They effectively chose not to extend the range of potential buyers to include most individuals, except as allowed within the scope of existing passive activity rules, which is a choice that I believe reflects the importance to the government of developing an administrable system that really limits the potential for fraud and abuse. The second top three item is really the electronic portal. I think the choice to develop an electronic portal to track and facilitate direct payment and credit transfers is really significant. The statute gave very little direction to Treasury and the IRS on how to implement Section 64, 17, and 18. Now, the government had experience of the 1603 grant program from a little over 10 years ago to learn from, but the challenges of these new rules are different. So this electronic platform is really important. It's developing right now, but we've not seen it. But my understanding is the government's soliciting input from stakeholders, at least at the beta testing level. Finally, I think the third thing on my top 3 list would be the rules relative to joint investments by taxable and tax-exempt investors. The government made a number of choices about how investors that could qualify for direct payments under 6417 could invest alongside or could not invest alongside investors that qualify to transfer the credits under 6418. In some ways, these choices are really quite restricted. For instance, Treasury and the IRS chose not to allow investors that could qualify for direct payments, generally tax exempt, from purchasing credits and then claiming direct payments for the credits that they purchased. Commentators on the proposed regs, as you know, have requested that the government reconsider this choice. Similarly, a partnership with taxable and tax-exempt partners cannot claim direct payment for the portion of the credit that's attributable to the tax-exempt partner. In other respects, however, the government allowed some flexibility. For instance, the Treasury and the IRS made clear that certain joint ventures may elect out of Subchapter K entirely, which is going to have the effect of allowing taxable and tax-exempt investors in certain projects to invest in the same project while letting the taxable investors take advantage of transferability and the tax-exempt investors take advantage of direct payment. So those are my top 3.
We're talking about tax-exempt investors. What elements of these regulations do you think will do the most to shape the way that tax-exempts invest in credit-eligible property?
Yeah, I'll take that first. So tax-exempt entities generally were not able to claim the credit, but having this direct pay option is now putting not only taxable entities, but tax-exempt entities, they're putting everyone on the forefront of taking a more active role in climate change and decarbonization strategy. So previously, tax-exempts did not own or place in service energy projects directly. They instead entered into PPAs with developers or with taxable entities. So although PPAs have helped accelerate clean energy deployment, it doesn't give direct financial benefits to these tax exempts that are interested in doing its part to promote clean energy. But with direct pay, they can take on a bigger energy projects faster. And for local governments and instrumentalities, they can take on these projects to directly support their communities. Since these tax exempts are not generally familiar with developing or owning energy projects and tax credit rules, it's even more important that we have Treasury regulations that provide clarity and certainty on how to qualify and claim the credits.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. Maybe switching to transferable credits, what in the regulations will most likely shape how that market develops?
Well, let me take that one. I think there are a couple of things that are really important in sort of market shaping in that sense. I think first, the time frame established in proposed regulations for the cash payment, no earlier than the first day of the tax year in which the credit is determined, no later than the due date for completing the transfer election statement, rises to the level of kind of a market shaping rule. The documentation and procedural requirements, such as a transfer election statement being filed by both transferor and transferee, the need to provide the transferee the required minimum documentation. Those sorts of rules are going to set the basic rules of the road, as it were, for everybody for credit transfers. Jamie, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think related to that, one of the questions that I got most before the regulations came out was, well, can the buyer start purchasing these credits and start using it to offset their estimated tax payment? And we weren't sure. The statute didn't say. It was uncertain whether they are able to take benefit of this immediately once entering into the purchase agreement. The regulations clarify, yes, that they can, that buyer doesn't have to wait until the transfer election has been effectuated by the seller, but they can start claiming the credit against this estimated tax payment. So I think that really provides the benefit as quickly as possible. And it provides the opportunity and planning for buyers to be able to take advantage of this in a multi-year.
Oh, I agree. That's a critical choice. And it provides a pretty good match between the transfer of cash, the claim of the credit against taxable, tax liability, and, pretty much in keeping with congressional goals.
Yeah.
So these temporary and proposed regulations do provide clarity in a number of areas, but there's got to be still some open questions. What are the most important areas out there that we're still looking for guidance?
Yeah, so I can take that. The first issue is the grouping and the numbering issues. So as taxpayers start pre-filing process and the election, of course, we'll see more issues that come up. But under the pre-filing of requirement, each entity has to obtain a registration number for each applicable credit property, which is a facility or property. And then the IRS will review the information and issue a separate registration number for each applicable credit property. And the question is, for projects such as large wind and solar farms, how easy will it be to keep a track of all the registration numbers and to what specific facility each registration number is assigned? And how will the IRS determine what portion of the credit eligible activities were generated from which facility or from which property, and whether that were eligible for direct pay or transferability? So these are all the important issues that I think we still need further guidance for purposes of easing compliance and administrative burdens. Second item I think that we need to get more clarity is the domestic content requirement. So certain ITC, the investment credit property, and certain production tax credit projects need to meet domestic content requirement in order to receive the full amount of direct pay. And that starts for projects that begin construction after this year. And if for any projects that begin construction after 2024, direct pay is reduced to 85% of their otherwise eligible credit. And then for facilities that begin construction after 2025, you are required to meet domestic content or the direct pay doesn't apply to you. The statute under Section 48 and under Section 45 provides an exception to this meeting domestic content requirement. The proposed regulations are silent on this issue. And that's where we really need guidance on domestic content and, what projects need to do right now so that they'll be able to meet the domestic content and get the full amount as direct pay. There's another one that I think we really need guidance. And this isn't necessarily under the 6418 or 6417 rules, but it's really under the underlying credit rules. Because for you to make an election for direct pay or to transfer, you need to first understand whether you qualify for all the underlying credit. None of the credits have new projects that qualify that used to not qualify before IRA. And taxpayers are still waiting to get guidance on what the eligible project is, what the eligible property is, how to claim the bonus adders. And there are various issues with the underlying credits. So if the quicker we get those guidance, the easier and the quicker that the industry will be able to take advantage of the transferability and direct pay.
It's interesting. My list is relatively short, actually, because it, just limiting it to the really high priority things. I think details about the electronic portal. We still don't have a sense of the user experience. I'm eagerly looking forward to seeing what's being developed. I think it's going to be very important. As you mentioned, Jamie, grouping issues. It sort of makes no sense for a wind farm with 120 turbines to maintain 120 registration numbers and annually update those numbers. This seems burdensome to me without clear benefit to the government at all. And finally, as I mentioned before, an exciting possibility of electing out of subchapter K for projects that are really jointly owned and operated by taxable and tax exempt parties. I think this will be really important, but the area of law with respect to election out of subchapter K was developed for the extractive oil and gas industry. It's not exactly clear how it would apply to the renewable energy industry or some of the other activities that could qualify for credits under the IRA. So I think further elaboration of that, which will naturally occur over time, that's something that I think is really important.
All right. Well, thank you, Jamie and Mike, sharing that important guidance for both taxable and tax-exempt investors around the direct pay and transferability, which is important as they make their investment decisions. Still a lot of open questions, it sounds like. So I look forward to speaking with you both as additional guidance comes out.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
If our audience would like to connect with Jamie or Mike, you can go on LinkedIn and connect with them directly. If you'd like additional information, just go on Deloitte.com and search Inflation Reduction Act. We have a lot of guidance there. And again, thank you to our audience for joining us today. We look forward to sharing additional topics with you in the future and hope you all continue to be well. Take care, everyone.